Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer, and thank you, as always, for tuning into the show. If you haven't as of yet, please mash down on that subscribe button. Leave us a review. Leave us some comments. We love getting feedback from our viewers and listeners. Oh, and if you're watching us on our YouTube channel, you know you can always take us wherever you're going audio-wise on one of the many fine podcast platforms at which you find the Lunch Hour. If you're listening to us on one of those fine podcast platforms, you want to see what's going on in the studio, check out our YouTube channel. And as always, please let your friends know, let your family members know, let everybody you know that you're listening to or watching and enjoying the Lunch Hour. Now, our guest today is someone I've known for quite some time now. We're going to talk a little bit about sort of how our paths have crossed in the past. His name is Brandon Arnold. He is the executive vice president of the National Taxpayers Union, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan public policy organization based in Washington, D.C. In this role, he helps oversee the strategic planning and government affairs efforts for NTU and its staff. He's testified before Congress and other state legislative bodies. He's appeared on TV and radio many, many times, and his publications, his writings have appeared in publications all around the world. He joined NTU in 2012. Has it really been that long, Brandon?
Unbelievably so.
As Vice President of Government Affairs, his previous positions include Director of Government Affairs at the Cato Institute. You know something? You know, I was at one point being considered for their very first Director of Government Affairs. I don't know if you know that.
Did not.
Yes,
cool.
That was at Cato. He was Manager of External Affairs in the office of former Lunch Hour podcast guest and former Governor of Maryland, Bob Ehrlich, in his energy office. He was an aide to Jim Sensenbrenner. He was the fiscal policy analyst at Citizens for a Sound Economy. And he was a research analyst at the NRSC. He holds a BA in political science and psychology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And I guess as an intro, Brandon, those two things seem to be very much interrelated. Politics is very much an exercise in psychology. Talk a little bit about that.
Wow, I didn't see that question coming in.
Sure.
And first of all, thank you so much for having me on the program here.
Always.
I actually started as a psych major, and then I started taking a few political science courses and got really interested in political science. And the more I thought about it, it was very similar thinking as what you just said. Like, why the heck do people have the views that they do?
Right.
Where did these ideological preferences, the willing to fight and die for certain ideological preferences, come from? Are those part of our psychology? Are they part of just how we're raised? There's just a fascinating line of research there that really got me interested in the whole field of political science, which has since expanded quite a bit, of course. But
Sure.
That was kind of the onset, the inkling of what got me into this field.
We may circle back on this because you've had a good solid career in the DC policy and political world, and so the issue of how those mindsets have changed and what you've sort of discovered over the years. Well, let's come back to that. First off, let's talk a little bit about the National Taxpayers Union and the good work that you guys do.
Yeah, I love talking about NTU. We are the taxpayers advocate is what we bill ourselves. There's special interest groups all across Washington, D.C. and the surrounding community here. They're advocating for various special interests. There's even in this town a group of lobbyists that advocate for the interest of lobbyists, believe it or not. But we recognize that there aren't really many folks that are advocating on behalf of taxpayers. And that means your interactions, of course, with the Internal Revenue Service, just the overall burden of taxation, but also all of these associated issues that impact taxpayers in a very profound way. That is, how much Congress is spending. What about these health care programs that many of us interact with on the regular, energy programs, technology, telecommunications? The issues that have faced taxpayers are very, very numerous, and yet there isn't a lot of representation on the behalf of the average taxpayer in Washington, D.C., or in state governments as well. We have a presence all across the country. So that is kind of why NTU does what we do, and that's why we are trying to fight on behalf of taxpayers each and every day.
With that in mind, right, obviously, very different mindset when it comes to the relationship or the attitude towards taxpayers between the last administration and the current administration. We obviously there are lots of concerns flying anytime you increase the IRS budget and the IRS goes out and wants to hire a bunch more people, even if it's just to go after rich people. We know that that's not true. I guess the IRS Commissioner Danny Werfel was up before Congress recently. Tell us a little bit about what happened up on the Hill. Why was he up there, Brandon?
Yeah, well, first of all, the specific committee that he was before was the Appropriations Committee.
Yes.
And if you're not familiar with Washington jargon, the House Appropriations Committee, Senate Appropriations Committee, those are the committees that write the checks effectively. They're the ones that spend money. So, of course, agency heads want to appear before these committees to ask for, guess what? More of your money. And that was why Werfel was before the House Appropriations Subcommittee earlier this week. He was asking for a boost to the IRS budget to the tune of about $100 billion, a little bit more than $100 billion over the next 10 years, to be fair. The IRS budget is about $13 billion, generally speaking. And if we want to get super nerdy about this, typically the IRS has been funded through discretionary spending. And that means the spending that is subject to the annual appropriations process, the money that Congress evaluates on each and every year. This is the times when we see Congress is going to shut down the government. They're not funding the government, whatever, all these crises, the manufactured crises that pop up each and every year. Recently, they have shifted, and this started really for the IRS sake. This started with the Inflation Reduction Act, just a couple of years ago, and that funding went on autopilot by and large. That $80 billion that we heard so much about, plus up to the IRS budget. That was under the mandatory budget, which means, like I said, it's on autopilot. Congress isn't evaluating that each and every year the same way that they provide scrutiny over the discretionary budget.
So let me just make sure I'm understanding this. So the IRS budget is about $13 trillion a year now. They want to add another 10 trillion. I'm sorry, billion. You're absolutely right. Never do math on the air. So it's right now it's $10 billion. It's $13 billion a year. They want to add another 10 billion. So essentially almost doubling that budget per year over the next 10 years. And as you said, right, they trim back the $80 billion appropriation to $60 billion. But if anybody tries to tamper with this down the road, they're going to be accused of cutting the size of the IRS. You know, when you create I guess my point here, Brandon, for you to comment on is when you create a new higher level baseline, it's almost impossible to go through and start cutting and paring that back in any kind of a meaningful way. Even if you had just recently doubled their budget, essentially, even if you wanted to go back to that, oh my God, people will be screaming, oh, you want to go back to, they want to cut the IRS. You know, President X wants to cut the IRS in half. Your thoughts here? Am I reading this right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's when terms like draconian get tossed around really unfairly. You're making these massive cuts to the budget and so forth. It's always better to cut those budgets before the plus ups take effect rather than after the fact, once those agencies have started to build out their staff and their operations. But yeah, that's absolutely the case. We had a $60 billion increase to the IRS budget, spread over 10 years, of course. They've already burnt through a tremendous amount of that. The one area where I think they really did actually need resources was business systems modernization, with improving the taxpayer service, making sure that people got their phone calls responded to, their emails responded to, and so forth when they had questions. So they didn't make mistakes that might necessitate an audit down the road. But they've burnt through these resources so quickly, funds that were supposed to take 10 years to be exhausted. The IRS says they're going to run out of money in 2026 in just a couple years. So they need a desperate infusion of cash. Meanwhile, they're out creating this free file program. This direct file program, this new IRS program. They're out there wanting to increase their enforcement activities. I think, the ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure here. I'm mangling the euphemism or the metaphor.
No, you got an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Yeah, absolutely.
If you improve taxpayer services, if you improve your ability to answer taxpayer questions when they contact the IRS, and that's been an absolute mess for years and years now. If you improve your system so you commit fewer errors and you're less prone to making mistakes, guess what? The need for enforcement activities is reduced. I would much rather them fix these problems in advance, trying to improve the way that people interact with the IRS rather than trying to punish them after the fact and crack skulls and go after people's hard-earned money after the fact, because we've seen far too many abuses taking place at the IRS, so many instances of mistreatment of taxpayers that we'd really like to minimize. Increasing their enforcement budget is going to only make that problem worse, not better.
It's the age-old situation, right? Where they claim they're going after the most well-heeled, the wealthiest folks, but of course, the folks who have the biggest problems are those at the other end of the income scale. I'm not talking about folks in poverty. Certainly, they have their problems. But if you're wealthy, you have a good accountant. You have a good tax lawyer. They're the ones who noodle these things through, and they make sure all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. But it's the middle class folks who can't afford their own attorney, who don't have a good accountant, who are doing their own taxes. They're the ones who get caught in the squeeze, and they're the ones who need this help the most. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's totally true. And, a lot of times what happens is the IRS will do these automated systems where they'll see discrepancies between what they think you're supposed to pay and what you've actually submitted to the IRS on April 15th. And they'll just send off these automated notifications. Oh, we think you owe $300 more than what you sent, or $1,000 more than what you sent. And if you're that middle class taxpayer, you can fight that. You can challenge the IRS, this behemoth of an agency, take on the federal government, and you might win. But for so many people, they don't have the time, they don't have the resources, they don't have the energy, and they're frankly a little intimidated. So a lot of times it's easier for people to just write those checks for $200, $300 and to go through that whole process. Whereas, like you said, if you're going after those wealthy taxpayers, if you're going after those big corporations, they will fight. They will push back with their teams of attorneys. So why do they end up auditing the middle class? It's the same reason. Why do you rob banks?
Right.
Because that's where the money is.
Right.
You're going to get the money out of these people. You're sending off these automated notices, which doesn't cost hardly any money for the IRS, and getting these checks to flow in. And for low income people, it can be even worse. We're seeing very high audit rates. There's racial disparity. Black people are being audited more often than white people. A lot of times that's taking place in these low income programs like the Earned Income Tax Credit, the Child Tax Credit, particularly the refundable portion. So lower income Americans who have very little ability to fight back, they're dealing with very, very complicated tax credits here. There's all sorts of questions about custodial children and the complexity of the programs and so forth. So there are more mistakes on those tax returns than there might be on an upper income tax return who has the resources, as you pointed out, to hire a CPA or to use more sophisticated tax software. And these people are getting audited at a higher clip. There's higher fraud rates. There's also just higher rates of mistakes and errors that are made on these tax forms.
Right. Again, if you're not out there, hiring your accountant or what have you, you get down this. My favorite is you get the bill, you pay the bill, and then on the rare occasion you get, literally this happened to us. You get a check for $6 from the IRS. You overpaid by $6. Really? Something. At this point in time, I'd just rather you hold on to my $6 because it becomes a huge pain to do. I'm happy to give you guys an interest-free loan of my $6. That's not a problem here. So let's talk about this issue of direct file and free file, because a lot of folks would think, oh my goodness, this is a really easy way to do it. There's a real danger at work if we have these systems in place. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so 2 programs there. Free File has been in place for many, many years now. That's a public-private partnership. Basically, if you meet a certain income threshold, it's around $70,000 a year, you can use private software to file your taxes for free.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of different, you go to Free File website, and there's a bunch of different private software companies that you can choose. They do your taxes as long as you're eligible. Free File. Now, the IRS just created this new thing called Direct File. They created their own taxpayer service, and they did so, I think, in an illegal fashion. They cited language that was passed in a pandemic bill that said, we're going to give you $15 million to study the feasibility and assess the cost of creating a program like this. They didn't specifically authorize the creation of the program. The IRS They didn't fully assess the cost of it as they were instructed to by law. They did create the program, which they were not instructed to
Sure.
by law. So now you have this program that's out there in a number of test markets. They only rolled it out in a handful of states initially.
Is it the same markets where they do the McRib, where McDonald's does the McRib? Because it seems that
I don't know.
Go ahead. I should have.
That'd be an interesting map. Check the andrewlanger.com. That map will be there. So they created this in a handful of markets. The reviews on it have been good, but it's just a tremendously duplicative program. We already have free file. There's no need to create direct file. And Warfel was before, like we said, the Appropriations Committee earlier this week being very coy about whether they intend to turn this pilot program into a full-blown program, again, without the authority to do so from Congress. But all indications suggest that they are going to turn this into a national program in the very near future.
And the danger, of course, is that the IRS then, again, as we talk about here, right? The good thing about these free file softwares are that you're doing it on your own. The IRS doesn't know anything about it until you click the button. But with a direct file system, the IRS can essentially start, it hides the true cost of one's taxes, right? Or what one otherwise ought to want to pay. And it gives the government even greater insights into, your accounts and accounting.
Yeah, I mean, and there's huge privacy concerns. The IRS has a horrible track record when it comes to protecting privacy. So you are submitting a lot more data here, as you suggest, than you might otherwise be providing to the IRS. But more fundamentally, I think the problem is this is putting the fox in charge of the henhouse here.
Absolutely.
Everything the IRS has talked about with regard to the need for more money has been less about improving taxpayer experience and more about squeezing more money out of taxpayers. They're using IRS funding as a pay for, saying, if you give us this $80 billion, we'll generate hundreds of billions of dollars in unpaid taxes because we can squeeze more money out of taxpayers. That's what they're saying.
Yeah.
And that's why they're attacking Republicans who are cutting the IRS budget, saying, oh, if we do that, then we're going to lose revenue ultimately.
And we know.
So you're saying that, and then you're creating this program that is supposed to fairly treat taxpayers and fairly assess how much they owe. You just said all you want to do is squeeze every last nickel out of taxpayers. Listen, I don't think people should evade taxes or anything like that, but I think they should absolutely minimize their tax burden in a legal fashion.
Right.
And all indications suggest this tax software could be pointing in the opposite direction.
Take advantages. Well, isn't it ironic? As the administration goes after all kinds of other industries and entities within industries for anti-competitive practices and antitrust issues. And yet here we have an example, once again, of where the government is trying to create a program that's going to drive out competition and at the same time maximize the amount of revenue that is generated from the people who will be using that product. I mean, am I wrong in saying that there's a certain degree of irony here?
Yeah, no, that's a great argument. I haven't made that one myself, but my blood was boiling a little bit when you're talking about all the actions that they've taken in the name of competition to hurt American companies and go after Big Sandwich and you name it.
I love it, Big Sandwich. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, here's competition. It's government created competition. If this is the path that they intend to follow in other industries when they feel like there's consolidation within markets, then oh man, that's pretty frightening.
And speaking of which, I mean, this is a good way to dovetail into some other issues you guys are working on at NTU. And by the way, the website is ntu.org.
NTU.org.
Because at the same time we're talking about this, we see what happens when there is no competition. We've got this new report you guys have put out on Social Security and Medicare. Right. When government runs these systems, they are going broke. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, these are reports from the trustees of Social Security and Medicare, large entitlement programs. And I wish I had positive news. There's a few elements that are of positivity here because the economy has been stronger than anticipated. We see slight improvements in the dates that these trust funds are going to be depleted. But we're still looking at, for Social Security, 9 years from now, Social Security Trust Fund is going to be depleted. At that point, we're going to have immediate cuts to benefits in the amount of over 20%. That is just catastrophe there unless we take action to fix it. Medicare's finances are only slightly better. Medicare Part A, which is the hospital portion, the inpatient portion of the program, trust fund is going to expire in 12 years. And the cuts there, about 11% cuts to the benefits paid to senior citizens relying on these programs. These are in desperate need of reform. We can reform these programs without dismantling them, but we need to have some degree of political courage in order to do so. And right now, that is very much lacking on Capitol Hill.
Well, and part of it is because anytime you start talking about reforming these programs, whoever's talking about reforming them gets accused of wanting to get rid of them. And that's a real problem, isn't it?
Oh, for sure. I mean, the AARP, anytime you come anywhere near these programs, they scream bloody murder. We've seen, across the board, politicians of both parties just beating up on their opponent for trying to do the responsible thing. To me, the irresponsible thing is just letting these programs continue as is, cutting benefits in the not too distant future. You're talking about somebody who's 58 now facing benefits as soon as they are eligible for these programs. That's hitting millions and millions of Americans. Putting our head in the sand, pretending these problems don't exist is the most irresponsible thing that we can do. We need to roll up our sleeves. We need to make some tough decisions. We need to have some political courage. We're just not seeing that from our elected officials.
I know in the policy work that I do, we are working with you guys at NTU on the healthcare side of things. Not so much, I don't do a lot with Social Security, but on the healthcare side of stuff, I do it. We all know that, in an era in which we've got a declining number of physicians, then that's a fact. We have fewer physicians that are being produced in America. We have to, import them from abroad, but especially in primary care specialties, right? We've got this gap between the number of physicians we have and the number of physicians we need to serve the patient demand that increased as a result of the passage of the Affordable Care Act. The only way you can control for the costs, especially in an era in which we've got massive inflation, is by curbing reimbursement benefits, and that of course leads to a feedback effect in all of this. You're absolutely correct. It is irresponsible for us to not talk about these solutions. And I don't know, Brandon. You're the executive vice president for this, so I know you're doing a lot of this work. Talk a little bit generally about the work that NTU is doing on the healthcare side of things.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of work to be done. You talk about structural reforms to our entitlement programs, but you also just talk about expanding consumer-facing products like health savings accounts.
Oh, yeah.
I think we need to dramatically overhaul health savings accounts. I think they're fantastic as they are, but I think we need to really think about utilization in other places for health savings accounts, higher contribution limits, more flexibility in utilization of these benefits. These are consumer-driven model of healthcare that puts people in charge of their dollars rather than having large insurance companies in charge of our dollars. Because if we're in control, in consultation with healthcare professionals, we're going to make better choices, more efficient, more economical choices about our well-being. So I think that's one of the biggest changes that need to take place. You talk about the doctor shortage. I think the nursing shortage might even be more acute. So we need to look at the way that we license and train our healthcare professionals, make sure that there aren't regulatory barriers, because there often are. There's often barriers to practicing cross state lines.
100%.
There's often scope of practice restrictions. So even though you're a highly qualified medical professional, because the state says you can do X but can't do Y, it ends up driving up costs and ultimately hurting patients and limiting the options that they have and access to care. There's a huge overhaul that needs to take place of our medical system. A lot of it is just fallen prey to special interest politics and various trade associations that have tried to help their membership at the cost of taxpayers and of course at patients.
Yeah, consumers especially. That's it. Listen, I'm going through it right now, which it's funny. You talk about the issue of how folks approach taxes and filing, and folks who are not well versed in the subject matter. Not that I want to digress too much, but I've been dealing with a particular issue. I got hurt at an event. And it is almost a full-time job to go and have to noodle through, getting the services that I need to find. But I digress. So, interesting thing happened a couple of years ago, Brandon. We're going to shift gears again. When I was still doing radio in Maryland, there was a very interesting report that came out via the comptroller of Maryland, a guy named Peter Franchot, Democrat, longtime Democrat. And this is right after the Trump tax cuts took place. And their report concluded, and I'm going to fudge the numbers a little bit, folks, so just stick with me here, but it was something on the order of 84%, 85% of Marylanders would either see their taxes not change or their taxes were going to go down under the Trump tax cuts. And it was a stunning report because, and I probably should have looked it up before I came on the air, but it was a stunning report because you had this Democrat, a very ambitious Democrat, his office doing what was essentially a fair analysis of these Republican-driven tax cuts. These tax cuts are set to expire. President Biden has said that he's going to allow them to expire, which means, of course, right, that taxes are going to go up. So in a place like Maryland, and you worked in Maryland, you and I are going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. But for folks in Maryland, you know, the 85% of Marylanders who saw either the taxes not change or their taxes go down, a lot of those folks are going to get a tax increase, aren't they, Brandon?
Oh, absolutely. And our friends at the Tax Foundation have done some phenomenal work on assessing how big a tax increase people would face in the event that we allow the Tax Cuts and Jobs to expire. And it's scheduled to expire at the end of next year, the end of 2025. Most of it, I should say, is going to be scheduled to expire. There are certain portions that were made permanent. But you look at things like tax rates, the expanded child tax credit, the expanded standard deduction, all of these things that help average families reduce their tax burden are going to expire. So a few examples, you know, if you see a family of three kids, two parents making $200,000 a year, so, you know, it's very solid income, their taxes are going to go up by $7,500. Wow. That's a huge, huge tax increase. But somebody, you know, a little bit down the income ladder, somebody making $60,000 a year, a single worker, their taxes are going to go up well over $1,000. So you talk to any family, whether they're making six figures or five figures, whether they're struggling or living comfortably, relatively comfortably. In this economy, I think we feel like we've been nickeled and dimed around every corner, whether it's a higher gas bill when we fill up our tank, right, whether it's $200 to fill up our basket of groceries when it used to be $120 or whatever. You know, just we're getting squeezed on so many fronts. We're seeing credit card debt skyrocket. We're over $1 trillion in collective credit card debt. I just don't think Americans are really ready to shoulder thousands of dollars in additional taxes. You know, President Biden has said we're not going to raise taxes on people making less than $400,000. Right. He's also said he's not going to renew the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. But like I just described, if you don't renew the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, perhaps in some modified form, people under $400,000 are absolutely going to see major tax increases.
You know, it's one of those things where if you're making $60,000 a year, an extra $150 in your pocket per month is no small matter, especially in an era in which we've got skyrocketing inflation. I mean, that's $150 a month. That's, you know, an extra $30 per week, $30+ per week. Again, never do math on the air, but you know, that means something. I mean, it means a lunch out, or it means the difference between, you know, filling up your car or not filling up your car. That's important stuff here. And I say that as an intro to expanding the standard deduction as much as they did. That was a I know this sounds like I'm gonna overstate it, but it was a revolutionary act. And I say this because, you know, I go to the dog park every day with my dogs, and there was a conversation about folks who were getting receipts for things that they were donating. And someone made the point while we were standing there, well, you know, I no longer bother to get the receipts because the standard deduction was increased so markedly a couple of years ago. And just it hadn't occurred to a bunch of folks there. Talk about the revolutionary nature of massively expanding the standard deduction, why that's important for the average taxpayer.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it speaks so much to tax simplicity for those very reasons. If you're taking the standard deduction, and the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act effectively doubled the standard deduction from about $12,000 to $24,000 and index it to inflation, which has become far more important over the past few years than perhaps it was in 2017. So, if your tax liability is below that point, you're looking at dramatic change to your taxes. But for everybody, it ended up taking about a third of people, 35% roughly of people were itemizing their taxes pre-TCJA, and then afterwards, I think it's around 9 or 10% of people are itemizing their taxes. So you think about the tax simplicity involved there. The process becomes tremendously easier if you don't have to account for every little detail. Your expenditures for the purposes of charitable deductions, mortgage interest deduction, state and local tax deduction, so forth. All of these tax deductions all of a sudden become less important if you're taking the standard. So it speaks a lot to tax simplicity, which in my mind is almost as important as how much you're paying.
Well, and it adds into the skepticism and concern over the move to direct file, right? You get rid of simplicity and you make it more complex, and you're now getting somebody else more deeply scrutinizing everything that you do. That raises the liability for these individual filers, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And one interesting note here is direct file, at least in its initial format, only does standard deduction, and it actually is even more limited than that. You can't itemize under direct file, which is interesting because most tax software will assess your taxes either way and determine which is lower and let you pay the lower amount. But you're kind of flying blind if you're only using the direct file program and you're only doing it through the standard deduction, because itemization might benefit you. You might result in a lower tax burden.
Doesn't it get into?
You won't even know about that.
Doesn't it get into getting back to this process whereby they twisted the legislation that allowed them to do a pilot study and they didn't do it? If you don't do a full pilot study and you're not taking into account upcoming changes in the tax law and how that's going to affect the demand for this product, one wonders whether or not to me it should have been done. This is something clearly that should have been taken into account, this push, and perhaps they didn't want to do that. They didn't want to make it known once again that they are going to let these tax cuts expire, right? Am I right there? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the level of what thought that they put into developing the software, the anticipation of tax changes, because obviously those are inevitable. But I would be skeptical about their amount of forethought here.
Yeah, of course.
They fudged the numbers in terms of the total costs, and they have not fully accounted for future costs, because not only do you have the traditional operation and maintenance, you do have to make significant changes to your software on an ongoing basis as tax law change. Even if the TCJA was reauthorized in its entirety, you would still have changes that occur naturally. Things like indexing is one, the incorporation of state changes as well, though there has been limited interaction between state tax systems and this new direct file system. That's something that still needs to be developed and worked out.
Let me come back now to this issue of psychology, because things have changed markedly. I just literally had a conversation with somebody about this today in the context of my possibly going back to my high school reunion in another few weeks. And and I went to a very progressive high school up in New York, and how things have changed in terms of my interaction with my fellow more progressive alumni. What do you think has changed over the last quarter century, Brandon, in terms of how people view politics from a psychological perspective?
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating. I think people get their news differently than they did back in the day. However far you want to look, 15, 20 years. I remember growing up, we would get our news as a family through whatever was on the television, the evening news program, 60 Minutes. We would read the newspaper. We'd read the local newspaper. We'd read the Baltimore Sun. I grew up in Maryland. Sometimes we would read the national papers like the Wall Street Journal. But now people get their news where they want. They have a lot more consumer control over where they're accessing their news. And I think that's a good thing, but I think it's also in some ways a bad thing, because people are seeking out specific viewpoints and getting those viewpoints. And that's good, but I think people should also challenge themselves. If you're a conservative, I think you should read the Washington Post and the New York Times, not because you agree with them or because you want to agree with them, but because you should understand where other folks are coming from. I think the same is true if you're on the left. You should watch Fox News. If you're on the left, you should read the Wall Street Journal. You should be exposed to different viewpoints. But right now, I think that's an issue that we have. We're becoming so compartmentalized that it's leading to more hostility toward opposing viewpoints, more demonization of people who view things differently than you do, rather than more understanding. And you can disagree in a fair and reasonable manner, or you can disagree and think the person is evil and trying to destroy everything that you believe in. Those are two fundamentally different things. More we move down that latter direction, I think, the more tension we have in our country.
So, folks know when they listen to the show or watch the show that I like to talk to my guests about their outside interests, because I think it helps to demystify, who we are as policy people or political people do, this kind of work in DC. One of the areas where I first met Brandon was he was working on an issue of great importance to him, having to do with craft beer and the craft alcohol industry in Maryland. Which was of great personal interest to him. And so as we talk about these outside interests, is that still something you're interested in, Brandon? What are the other kinds of things and are you interested in? How does the craft brewing, craft distilling industry, how are they faring now in Maryland?
Oh, they're doing fairly well. I think there's been a natural contraction of the craft brewing industry. We've seen a few breweries shut down. I think that was to be expected for people that are observing the industry. Sure. I think there was a bit of an overbuild in craft beer to the point where people didn't know the brewery that was, a few blocks down the road from them. They'd never heard of it before. So we had this overbuild, and now there's a natural market correction. But the reason I got into this, not only because I like to have a cold one on a Friday evening, but also I think it was a way of talking about public policy, talking about the regulatory and tax issues facing the brewing industry, small businesses that are trying to build a company just as everyone else is, but we're facing unique regulatory challenges in Maryland, for instance. And we've talked about this before, Andrew. Yeah. They passed a law in order to open up. Essentially, Guinness wanted to create this brewery in Baltimore, just outside of Baltimore, which is fantastic. They wanted to create this tourist destination. People come in, taste Guinness without flying to Dublin. Awesome, great, but the law didn't allow for it. So they decided they got to change the law. They've got to open it up to allow for this large tasting room for people to come in and try their beers. The initial version of the bill only allowed the Guinness brewery to have that ability, to have that larger tasting room capacity. And craft brewing stepped up and said, hey, that's fine to provide that for them. We welcome the competition, but let's create a level playing field for everybody. Absolutely. So everyone can have larger tasting rooms if their businesses take off and if the market supports that. And through the legislative process, there was push and pull and so forth. They ended up moving in the right direction ultimately, but there was a lot of bad ideas that came up. And the one that really sticks out was one politician snuck in. People wouldn't even take credit for this. Yeah. They were so embarrassed by it. They snuck in this provision where the Guinness brewery could sell beer up to a certain amount out of their tasting room. But once they exceeded that amount, they had to sell that to an alcohol distributor.
Right. That's
the alcohol distributor, put the beer on a truck, do a U-turn in the parking lot, bring that beer back to Guinness, the owner of it, the rightful owner, sell it back to them at a loss, and then they could sell it to consumers. It made 0 cents. All it did was pad the pockets of wealthy beer distributors who are very, very influential in Annapolis and in every state capital, to the great detriment of Guinness, more importantly, the great detriment of people that want to go there and all of a sudden had to pay more for no reason. So that's the kind of special interest anecdotes that I think helps to engage people in public policy and realize that even when you like politicians, there's a lot of folks out there that are acting in contradiction to what they should, and in contrast to what they say they're doing when they go out and interact with their constituents.
So when you're not doing this work, what are you up to? What are some of your other outside interests?
Well, I've got 2 young kids. My son's birthday is today.
Hey,
happy birthday, Matt. 7 years old. My daughter's going to turn 10 in a couple weeks. They keep me very, very busy. I chase them around, take them to practices, volleyball practice. My son's very into board games. I play a lot of board games with my son, and I love watching my Orioles, who are arguably the best team in baseball this year. Fingers crossed.
Listen, that we always have that little prayer that goes up there. I know I'll be at Camden Yards at some point. I've got a child moving to DC this summer, so I'm hoping to go catch some games with her up there. Well, Brandon, how do folks find out more about the good work you guys are doing at the National Taxpayers Union?
Well, our website is ntu.org. Please check us out there. We're also on all the social media, Twitter or X, whatever it's called, Facebook. We've got a YouTube page where we put clips of me and my colleagues appearing on television, radio, awesome podcasts like this one. So check us out there as well. Like, subscribe, all that fun stuff.
Well, thank you, Brandon, for joining us today. This has been yet another episode of the Lunch Hour with the Federal Newswire. Please, if you're watching us on YouTube, take a listen to us on those fine podcast platforms. If you're listening, give us a watch on YouTube as well. Subscribe, leave a rating, leave a comment, and let everybody you know how much you're enjoying the show. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.